That was to inform us, Jimmy. You can pick him. He's one of the better CIs I've ever worked.
You up on a wire?
That and more.
Alex Cottrell and Toby Huntingford present Caught on the Wire. This podcast is an episode-by-episode analysis of HBO's widely acclaimed TV series about the city of Baltimore, its people, and its many problems. Find more information about the show and all the episodes online at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Caught on the Wire, the podcast looking to cast a critical and analytical eye on HBO's comprehensive crime drama. I'm joined by Toby here today.
Hello.
And we're going to be just talking first a little bit about what the podcast is going to be like, what the format is going to be, and any sort of policies that we have on things like spoilers and whatnot. So Toby, tell us a little bit about, why did we decide to do this?
Well, we've been discussing, haven't we? We've been Wire fans for a good 2-3 years now. Not to sound like newbies, but we do consider ourselves veterans. And we've been, we're big podcast fans. We've been trying to find what we need from our podcast, which is nice week by week episode analysis. And The Wire, the most hailed show ever, has been sort of left off the radar. And we can kind of fill that niche. We can fill that gap in that market. So that's what we're going for. And I think that there have been a couple of attempts. We did find people that have tried to do this, and they've made 2 or 3 episodes of it. And for whatever reason, they've decided to stop. It was too much of an ordeal. And I think it's time that we step up now and, 12 years into the show, get it on the roll, kind of a week by week analysis. Does that sound about right?
You make it sound very dutiful, like we're kind of
absolutely. I think the show deserves this.
Up the mantle.
Yeah, it deserves this kind of attention. So.
Yeah, I think there's a few sort of good text reviews. Like I know tvcritic.org did a season by season podcast.
Oh yeah, no, that was very strong. It was a good.
That was very good.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an hour on each season, but obviously it doesn't quite get into that depth that we want. And I know that Alan Sepinwall, I think he's heralded. He's almost like what's that? That major TV critic. He passed away recently. America.
Roger Ebert.
Yeah, absolutely. He's kind of the Roger Ebert of the TV critic. World. Well, that's right. Yeah, he was heralded as kind of the top TV critic, and he has a place on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But Alan Sepinwall is kind of considered possibly the Ebert of the TV world, and he's done a very comprehensive, textual kind of blog style analysis of The Wire week by week, which I think a lot of people have been using to get their fix. But we're trying to. It's just called Sepinwall, Alan Sepinwall Hit Fix, I think. Hit Fix catch ups, Hit Fix recaps. Okay. There we go. Have a look for it. It's great. So I think that's closest it's come, but we want to bring it into the podcast realm, really. So.
Yeah, and we've been talking about it for a while, so we decided to finally get it sorted. We have a website at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com where we'll be putting all the podcasts and little blog posts every now and again if there's something to report. And you can contact us on there as well. And we have an archive of every podcast, so if you join us for whatever reason far down the line, there'll still be all of the episodes ready and waiting for you on the website. And the email is the same, caughtonthewire@gmail.com. If you want to comment on episodes, or if you've got criticisms of the podcast, or anything, really.
Absolutely.
So, what's our policy on spoilers?
Yeah, that's going to be a big one. We're really going to go down the path of spoiler heavy rather than spoiler free. We think, it's a 12-year-old show. There's somewhat unwritten rules about whether X years of airing, justifies people being able to spoil it freely. We think 12 years is certainly long enough. And I think overall it's just very difficult to review and analyze things without using spoilers. I mean, many critics do it and you don't really notice it because they're so adept at it. But, I've got much respect for those guys. But with us, I mean, there's so much limit to what you can say without using spoilers. And, that's our policy, really.
I think we just wanted to feel a bit uninhibited.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we took on the analysis, because it was always based. I mean, the very sort of upbringing of the podcast, as it were, was the fact that we used to have these conversations about it, and the conversations were always littered with spoilers. So we thought we would talk about what we know, which is the show as a whole. Yeah,
absolutely. So that's going to be kind of our take on it. That we will have we'll talk about the structure in a minute, but there'll be kind of a recap section at the start, and there's a good chance that we won't be spoiling much there because we're just going to be rehashing previous events. And if you are a first time viewer, we'd perhaps it might be useful for you to listen to those because The Wire is a very complex show, and we're going to try our best to break everything down into layman's terms and identify what the structure is and what things have gone down. So the first section, which might be 10 minutes max, really might be a good thing for you to involve yourself with to help you understand the show better. So I think that would be the only caveat attached to it. Otherwise, spoilers everywhere, basically.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, the podcast is for people who have watched the episode, and then this is kind of like a follow-on to it.
Yeah.
But with that in mind, I think it's fair to say that there will be spoilers for the episode and the episode alone.
Yeah, within the recap.
Well, sorry?
So spoilers for that episode within the recap, right? And then beyond that, we'd often perhaps mention how these scenes relate to later scenes, and in The Wire particularly, there's a lot of callbacks and call forwards to various kind of foreshadowing and backwards references. So I think it'll be very spoiler heavy throughout all the 5 seasons, even in these early episodes. So it's just worth bearing in mind if you're not very far into the show.
Yeah, I think the recap should definitely be of the episode. But yeah, we've got plenty to say about how it all connects. All the pieces matter.
Absolutely, that's what I was going for.
And is there anything else we need to say about the format? Should we just talk a little bit about what the structure of the show is going to be overall?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of podcasts begin with recaps. I don't think we're massive fans, are we, really? Some shows really go to town with rehashing the events that we've just watched, just to tell us about them again, and then they'll get into the analysis. I've just watched it, so I want to hear the analysis rather than just hear what I've watched. But I think with The Wire, it really does benefit from having just a little bit of straightening out with the plot and making things clear. So that's why we've decided to go for it in this podcast. I mean, would you agree with that? The general sentiment is very, very complex compared to most shows. So that'll be.
I think anybody who watches it doesn't matter how many times you've seen each episode. Like, there's always little bits that you might forget about. You come back to it and you go, "Oh yeah, I remember."
Oh yeah,
now.
Absolutely, yeah.
So just enough. It's just little things to sort of trip the mind into remembering certain events.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go with that.
So the structure of the show is basically going to start with the recap. Then we're going to have a little bit of that'll be the main meat of the show. Will be the discussion time after the recap, where we'll be making key points about themes in the show or posing questions to one another, and that'll be kind of where we can just have a kind of general discussion point. Really, there's nothing too specific there. Following that, we might talk about favorite scenes and negative parts of the episode. That'll be kind of like the pros and cons section. And then with the overview of the whole episode having been established, we'll talk a little bit about the episode title and the epigraph, because those two things are very carefully selected for each episode and have real bearing on what goes on. They're kind of making subtle suggestions towards the events in the episode. We thought we would dig in there as well. There's a certain kind of theme throughout the episodes, like all the episodes in season 1, for example, are the something. So the detail, the target, the buys, It's just nice to talk a little bit about that sort of slightly less known detail, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And the titles, they vary season to season with what theme they adopt. I mean, the season 2 port-based titles are mostly made up of kind of sea-based metaphors. So ebb tide, storm warnings, undertow, and we'll delve into things like that and what that imagery kind of means. And so those would be the 3, right? We have title, epigraph, and also standout character as our kind of 3 quick fire sections at the end. We'll have little mini discussions about what those mean.
I forgot about that one actually.
Yeah. So that'll be for us at the end, and then I think we'll wrap things up. We'll probably aim for around an hour for each episode, but obviously with podcasts that can often be very flexible depending on how into it we get.
Okay, so let's. I mean, I can't believe that we're about to start this. I can't believe that we're about to every single week for the next goodness knows how
I
long.
think we'll be finished if we keep it to schedule. It'll be, late autumn 2015. We'll go with that. 60 episodes, 60 weeks.
All right, well, I guess there's no time like the present.
Okay, let's go.
You happy now, you bitch?
She'll teach you to give a fuck when it ain't your turn to give a fuck.
So, episode 1, The Target. Toby, give us the recap. What happens in this episode?
Okay, so this is quite a whirlwind, isn't it, this episode of various facts and stories. But we obviously open with a very simplistic scene. Snot Boogie, or Snot Boogie. And they've been shot in cold blood. And McNulty's chatting with quite a cooperating witness about this. And I think the main line to take away from this is this American man, and the idea being that you're entitled to oh god,
I think
yeah.
it goes back to that old saying about I can't remember who said this now. Someone should email in and tell me, or I should just Google it. But it's I don't believe in what you have to say, but I will defend your right to say it. It's kind of along that kind of traditional liberty. They don't agree with his actions, but to shun him out would to be against the very sort of nature of what they believe. This is America. We believe in liberty. It's it's quite rousing, actually.
But so that kind of sets up the season, and David Simon often says that the opening scene of a season sets the tone for that season, or the underlying meaning of it. And I think with this one, it very much speaks to the entire series in general, and the main theme of everyone being entitled, but no one being able to follow through, or everyone being condemned from the start almost.
And there's a lot of very pointed shots.
Yeah.
In the opening, there's a lot of very careful framing of there's the kids there's the officer at the scene. Those trails of blood kind of suggesting.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this one thing that I remember when I first watched the show. I actually quit after the first episode the first time. I think as a lot of people do. One of the things I noticed is that I'd seen the logo for the wire with the kind of oscillating wiretap, readout with the kind of the waveform on the screen. I thought that the blood with the sparkling sirens, or the kind of reflection in the sirens, looked very much like that kind of on the screen. I thought it was a great callback, or that the imagery kind of matched up well with the show's logo. The kind of trailing blood down the screen.
Visual poetry.
Absolutely, visual poetry from the very first shot. So that's one thing I noticed. That was very cool. But should we move on to beyond the credits? We have obviously that the show is mainly about, or this episode is mainly about setting up the detail. This is sparked by D'Angelo's very unjust court hearing, where two witnesses are intimidated to various outputs. One of the witnesses is intimidated successfully and doesn't finger D'Angelo for shooting Pooh Blanchard in a high-rise earlier. And one of them, William Gant, decides to face up the pressure and tell the truth that D'Angelo did finger him. Or, sorry, not finger him. That's a bit strange. That D'Angelo did shoot Pooh Blanchard as he witnessed. And this causes a bit of a ruckus in the court, and it passes from Judge Phelan to McNulty. And McNulty passes information that he understands about the projects that Avon Barksdale is involved with drugs and is the bigwig. This information passes from McNulty to Judge Phelan. Phelan then passes this information to the commissioner, or the deputy commissioner, Irvin Burrell, which is then passed to Colonel Forster. And Forster then designates Rules and Daniels, who are the homicide major and narcotics shift lieutenant, to bring about some reports about Avon Barksdale, or what the department knows. And this eventually results in the assembling of a detail to take down Barksdale to appease the Judge Phelan's concerns about criminals being able to muscle into courts and change the path of justice.
They're Jimmy's concerns, really, aren't they?
Yeah, I guess they really are Jimmy's.
He is kind of the source in that sense.
Well, once he's opened up the bottle, it becomes everyone's problem, much to their anger. And Greg's hurt Carver from narcotics come across, and then McNulty Santangelo from homicide are the initial detail crew, and then Rhonda from the courthouse is listed as a prosecutor. And obviously this process of assembling the detail, which defines the episode, is generally sort of defined by disdain from McNulty from absolutely everyone involved. No one's happy that he's shouted out about this witness stand down, which is got everyone's neck in a twist. So we also have a big half for D'Angelo here in this episode. We see him dressed down and demoted from organising drug trade in one of the towers to organising drug trade in one of the low-rise courts. And that was because of his assumed very impulsive behaviour by shooting Pooh Blanchard in the high-rise. And during this process, we learn that D'Angelo is cut from a very sort of different jib to most of the people he associates with. This is shown most evidently when he refuses to beat up Johnny, he carries out a money scam which is devised by his junkie mate Bubbles. And D'Angelo refuses to beat him up, or even offer sorry, I have to edit a few bits of this, but to offer a directive to his crew, leaving them to make meat of him. I think the show takes a break from the tight plotting for the last 10 minutes, and we see more into the personal lives of some of the characters. Greg sort of goes home to a comfortable living with her girlfriend, Cheryl, although she's not very pleased with the amount of paperwork the case is causing her, or McNulty's big shake-up is causing her. McNulty and Bunk go for drinks and talk about Jimmy's rocky divorce, among other things. And finally, that's kind of an idea of the overall episode direction. We end with the season opening cliffhanger of sorts. Hungover Bunk's called to a scene where the cooperating witness from D'Angelo's trial, William Gant, has been murdered in cold blood. This is less than a day after he testified against D'Angelo. Make of that what you will. And that's our recap for this episode.
So with the recap sorted, I think we have a general idea of what goes on here. It's still a lot, isn't it? There's a lot to take in. Every time you mention a new scene, you realise that it connects to another scene.
Exactly.
You've got to be careful not to overdo it on the details, because I think you don't want the recap to
definitely, I mean,
be the length of the episode, basically.
Yeah, we said at the start that recaps weren't our thing, but once you start, you can write a few basic bullet points, but once you start talking about them, there's just so much other things that appear in front of you, and you have to kind of go to that and this, and yeah, it's quite a fine art keeping it brief, particularly with the Wire episodes, and particularly
this podcast is like the Wire in the sense that no matter how we format it and how we structure it, we're screwed anyway. We're not going to be able to get everything in. It's not possible.
Yeah.
Accepting our fate.
But we've got to play. The show deserves it. So we'll fight against. Right, should we move into our main discussion and see
let's jump into the meat. Okay, so what do you want to start with?
Should we kind of talk about your main views on the episode? So I mean I thought, particularly when watching it again, it really is just telling a simple story. Like it's the ultimate, drama setup pilot episode. They assemble a team that's going to, take down this big criminal organization. It's the police procedural A point. And when I first watched it, I did not get that from it at all. It kind of felt huge and directionless for me. Even though what actually happens is basic. And I think on second viewing, you really understand that it's just a traditional setting up the team episode. And the convoluted way that it goes about it seems to be in keeping with kind of all the bureaucracy the show is trying to portray. So I think it masks what a lot of characters you should be seeing. So, for example, characters like Forster and, Irvin Burrell. If you haven't seen the show before, you might not even know who those characters are, but they're the bigwigs at the top of the police. And, they're the ones who receive the call from the judge, which is another scene we don't see. So many scenes aren't actually witnessed on the show. But these guys spark off the big investigation and detail assembly that eventually comes down to Daniels, who's kind of the most senior guy who actually spend a lot of time with. And I think once you've got an overview of everyone from seeing the show once, you understand that, but it's obviously a very complex way of putting it like here. So I was wondering whether you thought that, it really benefits from a second viewing because, things get cleaned up a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that it's a show that opens up, as you watch it more. I mean, the first episode is very disorientating, on the first viewing. And I think that a lot of emphasis is placed on the higher echelons of the drug the street gangs, the ghettos.
Yeah.
We see all these major players and the power and the influence that they have and who their subordinates are and who answers to who. We really kind of see that. But with the police, there's a lot more ambiguity. It feels like there's lots of people that we don't see very often. And you mentioned Forster. It's not really sort of 100% clear sort of what his role is. Who what's his title? We know that he has a rank, but where do these people sit in terms of the organization? Maybe that's because the drug trade has a sort of simpler organization.
Yeah, I mean...
But I did feel like there was a bit of, a certain cloud over the main players in the police department. When I first watched it, I do remember being a bit confused about who was Burrell and who was the major and, hearing all of these ranks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but because the police is by its nature official, it's kind of a public body. It's got all this bureaucracy attached to it, and everything is subservient to the numbers and the figures and the paperwork. And you really get that impression with the police angle of this episode. And then obviously things are very grassroots and basic with the drug crews, and it all kind of works towards, who knows what, who needs murdering, who doesn't need murdering, who's stepping in line. And it's much easier to understand that, and therefore kind of Avon, who's at the top, his thought process is very clearly put forward, and his motivations are there, particularly just from the one scene we see of him in the strip club where he's kind of the king of everything from his balcony, dressing down D'Angelo. Yeah. It makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? The kind of institutional structure is there much more presently.
And it's such a classic sort of pose for the visual style to have Avon there sort of looking over his kingdom, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a very kind of like, he's obviously the boss, he must be in charge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very well done. It's actually one of my favourite scenes. I'm sure we'll come to it in the episode. It's a great character introduction. I mean, speaking of characters, this show really does not care what you think. I mean, it throws you in the deep end. Think about, the second scene. I mean, straight after Snot Boogie, we're just thrown into it. I mean, that courtroom, you enter the courtroom, and Noti goes into the courtroom. All of a sudden, 12 major characters are on the screen right there. No one's batted an eyelid. You just, most people won't even know it yet, but you've got to keep up. And the show won't make any concessions for you whatsoever. And that was another key thing that really struck me when I watched this again.
It's completely without fanfare, isn't it? There's a bunch of, that courtroom you've got. This is from memory. You've got Levy, D'Angelo, Stringer, Judge Phelan,
Stinkum,
Weebay.
Yeah. I think Savino's sitting there as well. There's also that strangely never seen again prosecutor, who's looks very, very typecast in kind of a procedural law court role, actually. You thought Rhonda might. Actually, no, Rhonda would have been put in there because she's a narcotics prosecutor.
Yeah.
So I guess this is a murder, isn't it? But yeah, there's she's the only character that you might assume is perhaps got more of a role to play, but never kind of resurfaces. And yeah, everyone else is just there. It's just it's just laid out on the table for you.
What's also interesting is that we learned that when I first watched it, just Stringer Bell draws that little sketch with it says like "fuck you, detective" on it.
Yeah.
He draws that little sketch and shows it to McNulty when they're in the courtroom. We kind of learned that, Stringer has a bit of artistic talent.
Absolutely.
Never shown again, though.
Yeah. I guess
never kind of picked up on it again.
Yeah. I mean, that speaks to a lot of the...
just him drawing on a napkin or something. You've thrown a character trait at me. Give it to me again.
Yeah, it speaks
make me feel like it's real.
Yeah, it is a strange one. The Wire isn't... it definitely has teething problems, I think, and establishing who your character is at the start is difficult, and I imagine that they probably. Do you reckon they regret that? It's quite a nice little touch, but it doesn't feel like Stringer at all once you've seen it all.
There are a few touches across the first few episodes that suggest that they're finding their way with certain characters. I was going to bring this up in the second episode, but I think it still is relevant here.
Yeah,
and that's that. Especially in the first two episodes, you can see that the show tries to establish a couple of catchphrases in places.
Yeah.
Jimmy's got his "what the fuck did I do?"
You happy now, bitch?
Are you happy now, bitch?
Yeah.
And they use them like it's used sort of pointedly. It's used to represent that this is, look, they're saying it again. They're saying the thing. They're saying the phrase.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's a little not particularly tasteful for The Wire, and they do drop it pretty quickly, which I think is the right decision.
Yeah, that's what I mean. There was even that one scene when they go to that the call that Bunk went on to that apartment where he found the decomp. I think they say their catchphrases back to back, sort of almost in parody once you've seen it all. It's quite interesting. So no, absolutely, it's a good point there. And I mean, when you first viewed it, did you find the Ghetto stuff much more enthralling, or the police stuff? I mean, what was it for you? I mean, I think most people are drawn in by the plight of Bodie and Wallace and D'Angelo out in the courts there. It all feels a lot more gritty and real and relatable.
I mean, if nothing else, it feels like it has been approached in a very different way than what you would expect, because Hollywood and regular TV teaches you to have certain expectations of those kind of characters, like they're a drug dealer, so they're rough and they're ruthless and they don't give a shit about anybody, and they're dehumanized. They're dehumanized by a lot of formats, and when you're confronted by these characters that feel conflicted and feel vulnerable, and they're not just mindless kids on the street, like they're a real kind of product of their environment. We see their kind of personal struggles and what they want to achieve and how they feel stuck. It's just a completely different approach to that kind of character. And those sort of ghetto boys just come across as like henchmen in James Bond films, just totally blank. They're just there to be kind of furniture to big action.
Yeah, I mean,
and it never really comes with The Wire, which is refreshing. And it does, like you say, it grips you very quickly on, very early on. Sorry, because it's just a completely different approach.
Yeah, I mean, particularly when they put it back to back with so much sort of shifting through the office politics of McNulty and Rules and Jay Landman. It's a nice change 25 minutes in. I think one of the big sentiments they kind of build on in that is just how bored everyone looks. I mean, most of the time they're just showing people sitting outside and not doing anything. It's just this isn't the criminal world that most TV shows paint. It's not full of action and guns and just lots of swearing. It's just a bunch of people sitting around making some money. But it feels very honest the way they're going about it. Obviously, there is that one scene which I really enjoyed the first time around, that big action where Johnny's chased around the ghetto and then he's eventually threatened to be thrown over the expressway for stealing $10, and that speaks volumes about the lifestyle these guys, the kind of the morals that they've grown up with, and how broken everything is there in that little community.
Yeah, I mean, despite the kind of it does try to present a human aspect to these drug dealers, but they still have their code. They still are ruthless.
Yeah,
they'll still not take any shit from anybody. Going back to what you were saying earlier, we're talking about sort of people sitting around looking bored. There's some parallels being thrown in straight away on that theme in the first episode, where we have the sort of the sit down, not doing much period, where characters are just kind of shooting the shit. We see that in the police, for example, where we have Greggs, Herc, and Carver all having a little conversation whilst Kima is on the typewriter.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
Carver comes up with his not quite as clever as it sounds line about wars. Can't even call this shit a war. War's end.
Yeah.
This is yes. I mean, it's
one of those statement moments.
The reaction is.
Yeah, it feels like it wants to be something, but yeah, you're not quite sure, really, are you? It is a strange one, but yeah, I thought that sequence was quite funny, where they talk about trickle and roll or something like that with with the
piss doesn't roll, or the shit doesn't trickle, or
whatever
way around it is.
No, it's a lot of fun, and they and obviously you get a nice bit of development with Greggs identifying that they haven't done the ID numbers correctly, something like that. They're completely skimped on the paperwork, and all they really care about is splitting heads, and is it clanking knuckles or something very violent sounding, and that's kind of the way they believe policing should be done, and they brand it the Western District way, and it kind of defines their character for a lot of the show, really, and it's kind of a great thesis that they live by. Great.
They're presented as very sort of foolhardy. On. I think Herc and Carver are almost like comic relief. It does feel that way, that they have a good time and they want to do it their way, but they also make mistakes and piss people off. They're kind of the happy-go-lucky sort of classic pair, as it were. They're presented in that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and but they feel so real as well. It's not just like they're injected. You really feel like there's people you know that if they were to be put into the police force, you'd know that they'd skimp on all the stuff that matters and really just try and enjoy the thrill and the adrenaline rush of the exciting bit. They almost kind of represent the casual viewer that they're after just that little spike of excitement, aren't they? Kind of thing. So.
Really, you think that's a sort of a satire on a TV audience?
Anything can happen. Anything it could be. You got to delve into these shows. So, but yeah, that's my take on it. I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So
later on, we see another similar scene like that, where there's it is all four of them, isn't it? It's Poot, Wallace, Bodie, and D'Angelo, and they're at the orange sofa, and it's where they're talking about it's where Wallace gets berated for taking Johnny's fake money.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Wallace demonstrates an unusual, or not unusual, but unexpected level of smarts when he sort of talks about Hamilton not being president.
Yeah, absolutely. He's clearly the one who's been listening at school, and even D'Angelo, who you kind of assume is the figurehead and the smart one, and has a bit of emotional intelligence. He's none the wiser. But I think that scene's great for that. I think that's one of the really great lines of the episode is "Money be green," and it kind of points down to it. And Bodie.
Money feel like money.
Yeah, absolutely.
Despite the, is it coffee that Bubbles is using when we see them preparing the fake money?
Yeah, I think so. And he's
give it that money feel.
Absolutely, it's a pretty genius scam, and you realise that it would have worked, and he's probably been using it for ages. But as soon as D'Angelo comes along and starts counting the money, all of a sudden they've brought down some higher blood and he's catching him out. So a change up in the hierarchy catches people out. So
I mean, you sort of suggested that although D'Angelo has been demoted, he's still vastly better than. Is it Ronnie Moe?
Ronnie Moe,
who has the pits before him? He's obviously vastly better than him because he sees the operation and says, "Has it always been going this way? Like, has it always been like this?
Yeah,
this
exactly.
isn't the way you're supposed to do it." So
that's a great.
He's not presented as a hump at all.
Yeah, it's a good bit of exposition for showing how the basic drug trade works with the whole deal and then you serve. And obviously, D'Angelo also, he's on his game, as he says to Stringer. Like he's just been berated. Like his career was hanging in the balance, or his drug career, and he's clearly gonna, not cut any corners here. And you clearly get the sense that there's been a bit of change in the low rises and a bit of fresh discipline injected into the proceedings, even if that doesn't extend to the actual beating of Johnny, where we really understand kind of what D'Angelo's about and that he really does have some empathy underneath everything else. So. There's some really good scenes there.
Speaking of exposition, I kind of got the sense that the scene with Judge Phelan and McNulty after the courtroom, I really kind of get a sense that is a big exposition scene for the audience, because McNulty spends a considerable period of the scene telling us all about the Barksdale crew. And all of the things that they keep doing, and the fact that what we're seeing in this courtroom scene is not a one-off. It's not this is a new case. This has been ongoing for some time.
Yeah.
And we're picking it up in the middle. It makes it clear. It kind of fills out the case to come in a way. I feel that scene does.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you get the sense that it's only now that I think it's the 10th occasion that they've managed to muscle out and sort of intimidate witnesses in court successfully. And you get the sense that Phelan's at the end of his tether. As is McNulty, who came to court just because he, wanted to see if this happened again. He wasn't even working his own case. And it was a great time for the show to really just, this is the playing field. Avon's in the towers. He's had him for a year. No one's working. The department's broken. Let's get on with the wire. So it's very much just sort of setting the table for the show, isn't it? It definitely makes a point of that. I thought what did you think of the little McNulty's friend Fitzhugh? I mean, he pops up a few times during the show, isn't he? And I think that it's often used to show, how if people tend to think that the way the Baltimore Police Department operates is kind of typical of police officers, you really get the FBI to contrast and to juxtapose it with where, they're really operating with federal funds and they've got their absolute, top of the line equipment. They, in wiretaps all over the place, up in Philadelphia and New York. I think it's quite funny to see how, struck McNulty was by the technology they're using, like the fact that they've got a live stream in a house. I mean, for us in 2014, that's a bit ridiculous, but for him, it was a new world for him. His face really lit up with wonder.
Yeah, it really places a certain emphasis on wealth inequality. It's, a theme, that's sort of an underlying theme across the whole show, really. But we see it on the streets, and we see, police commissioners and whatnot going home to their really nice places, and then we see people like Bubbles, that it's playing on that big difference in class.
Yeah.
But it's also shown through the institutions as well, like you say. So the FBI, we see that they have all this ridiculously expensive equipment that is entirely alien to a police officer who not necessarily needs it more, but, is certainly hindered by not having access to it.
Absolutely.
I guess we could say McNulty is very fortunate to have that kind of line into the FBI's resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a great bit. I was listening to the commentary actually recently with David Simon. As a veteran, I think I've done a few of the commentaries, and this is definitely one you should check out if you haven't. David Simon kind of almost stating a prelude for the show, really. Like, he explains what the show's about, goes over a few of the scenes. It's a really good insight. And there was one bit on the commentary where he talks about the scene with Fitzhugh, and how it was only filmed, I think, a month after 9/11 occurred. Like, it's really going back. And they predicted that the FBI would turn their mandate onto anti-terrorism, which is, Fitzhugh's lamenting the loss of drug cases. And this is a complete prediction on David Simon and Ed Burns' part. And I think it just goes to show how people in charge of the show are just so in tune with American politics that they could see that coming a mile off, even if they filmed it a couple of months before the mandate was released. I thought that was pretty impressive, really, and goes to show how important the show is, and that these people really understand, and the things that they're telling you, really are things to be concerned about. So that was an interesting nugget of information, and obviously a plug for the commentary. Definitely check out the episode with the commentary, which you'll find on the DVD.
Yeah, it demonstrates a very impressive level of foresight, and I think the writing of the show in general is greatly enhanced by the fact that I believe many of the writers are first and foremost sort of journalists, really.
Yeah.
They're people who have kind of written about the real life crimes. They're not so much creating a fiction as adapting their knowledge on the real world subject to television.
Absolutely. Or was it Ed Burns who was he spent years in the police getting frustrated, didn't he? I think he is pretty much the McNulty of real life, or as close as it gets to McNulty.
Yeah, right.
Then we have, I think, David Simon was the Baltimore Sun journalist, wasn't he? Which we'll come to in season 5, of course. But these guys really had their eyes on Baltimore. But they clearly love the city as well. But they want to fix the problems and at least shed some light on them, even if they're not going to offer us any kind of solutions.
Yeah. So I'm going to chuck a little something out there now. So with The Wire sort of being this show of complexity that it is, it still has to have a pilot episode. It still has to do certain things that we expect from pilot episodes, like we expect to see certain concessions being made for the audience in order to ensure that people are going to sit down for the second episode. There might be concessions for distributors by way of nudging people along certain plot lines in order to demonstrate that it has commercial viability. Yeah. So do you think that there are any sort of good examples of that in The Wire? Because, people like to talk about how The Wire, it feels very real and it feels like there isn't any hand-holding. But I think that there is still hand-holding, but it's a lot more subtle. A good example, the most obvious example in the first episode is the very ending where we see Gant, dead on the floor, and then we get the flashback That's him right there, you know. Just so that you remember, just in case you didn't remember the name, it's this guy again. You know, it's sort of doing a little bit of hand holding. That's possibly an unfair example because that's the most extreme point in the show's entire runtime. That's the most extreme hand holding. It starts off big and, you know, lets go from there. But you know, in the second episode, it opens. The very first thing that you hear after the titles is McNulty saying, "Yeah, that's the victim, the guy from the homicide case or whatever. That's Gant from the homicide case." He basically straight up says what you're looking at just to remind you what happened in the previous episode.
Yeah,
and it doesn't feel very typical of The Wire. Those kind of moments do stand out because the fact that there is very, very little of that in general.
Yeah, no.
Can you think of any examples that struck you, Toby?
Nothing particular, perhaps, but I know that I think in the early episodes when they referred to their colleagues, they'd often use the title or, you know, their role. So Prosecutor Perlman or something like that, or, you know, Head of Violent Crimes Unit. And then, you know, when people chat from day to day life, they'd never do that. You know, you're just a colleague or a mate or whatever. And that is clearly just a concession for the audience to make them aware of who they are, and their role within this kind of society and universe. But, I think overall there's so little of it. Obviously that big flashback you mentioned was HBO, mustering in and saying, you know, we need this because we need an audience. And I know you want, you know, giving you a lot of freedom here, but we do want an audience. And I mean, I think they were right. I think it really did, you know, it gives people a little bit of a breather at the end after so much concentration. And I mean, I didn't notice the first time that was the witness. But I think, you know, on one occasion it works. I mean, it's done a bit strangely with that weird kind of echo. I don't think it needed that, but,
very sort of strange zoom.
Yeah, that's the bit that was strangely done for me. I mean, perhaps they wanted to make it really certain that we're not going to do this again, and this is meant to be jarring because we don't like it. But overall, it was, yeah. I think it needed to be there, but perhaps it could have been done a little bit more tastefully. But overall, I think it's like that. I think in terms of exposition, the main thing I take away from it is once I've watched The Wire, the actual use of exposition dialogue as it's known in other shows becomes so much more obvious. Like with I've been revisiting Lost, you know, recently, and so many times, even episode to episode, they constantly, when they talk about events, they refer to the events in the sequence they happened, or they instead of, you know, naming the event, they talk about what the event was, which you just don't do, and it becomes really obvious once you've seen The Wire. It kind of helps you to identify flaws in TV in ways that don't really integrate with real life, and I think that just sort of shows how The Wire makes so few concessions, and the ones that we see here in the first couple of episodes are perhaps the only ones, and that there's very few, and that, you know, it's great that David Simon and his crew got so much creative freedom to really make their universe the way they wanted it to. And you can see that it's not a drawback at all, because once you've watched it 2 or 3 times, you're not asking questions, you're just enjoying it. You're enjoying the authenticity of the environment. And, you know, as long as you've got the patience to go with it, it's a massively rewarding way of making television. And I'm really glad that they got the chance to do it.
Yeah, I think it's very generally, it's very tastefully done.
Yeah.
But the sort of I suppose there is one example of, say, a budgetary limitation to the show, where there's a scene that shows sort of a landscape shot of the pit where D'Angelo has just gone to work, and we see the towers in the background. But I think in that real part of Baltimore where it was filmed, the towers had been knocked down some years before.
Yeah.
But so they did some CGI to put the towers there.
Oh, it's very fuzzy, isn't it?
Really dreadful, really dreadful CGI. I mean, it's not a new show. I know it's like 2002.
Yeah.
But it's only shown for a couple of seconds, so it's not a major issue. But it's pretty bad CGI.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it definitely benefits from being filmed on such a grainy celluloid camera. Or is it celluloid? I think it's just almost just a basic digital camera, isn't it? Almost, it's got that feel to it. It really does try and go for the grainy, everyday look, and I'm sure that masked a lot of the crappiness of the CGI. But yeah, it definitely looks horrible, and that they keep reusing them through the first season. There's also another moment early in season 3. Harking ahead to spoilers, of course, but there's a very, very jarring CGI usage with the destruction of the towers, which remember that really, I almost thought that they shouldn't have used that really, because it really, really took me out at the moment. But overall, I mean, the show is so based in everyday realities and kind of the formalities of day-to-day life, they don't need to use it, and it works really well. So it's quite built for the small budget that it kind of possesses. So
Yeah.
yeah.
There's no sort of very limited on its. Certainly seems very limited on its visual effects.
Yeah.
So you were saying about you're saying also about the camera, and obviously having that grainy feel. The sort of frame of the camera does change somewhat when we have sort of security camera shots.
Yes.
That are almost if they are taken directly from the camera's feed itself. They're 60 frames a second. They're black and white. They've got the kind of like the track lines or whatever going across it. There's the most notable perhaps is the one that's used in the lift, where we see Forrester and Rules sharing a somewhat awkward journey up on the lift. So it's a strange choice of shot because there's nothing obviously going on in the lift. It just suddenly switches to this sort of security feed.
Yeah.
Seems like an interesting choice of shot.
Yeah, I mean, the intrigue of the scene is the kind of the camera itself, isn't it? The fact that you're looking through this sort of CCTV camera. It's used an awful lot in this episode, actually, isn't it? Just I get you in the mood for surveillance and understand that that's kind of a lot of what the show is about.
Yeah.
And the fact that every move you make is scrutinized by those above you, and that, you know, you're always got to be on your best behavior, always in a pressurized situation. And, you know, McNulty would be able to get things done a lot more efficiently if he didn't have the bosses watching him. And it kind of just speaks to that idea of, you know, everyone is trapped really in this society, and that, you know, everything's got to run according to the top man.
And screens within screens, that's a common theme. We see the camera pointing towards the character that we're interested in, but on a screen, so on a security camera screen of some kind. We see that a lot, especially in the first few episodes. That's
right. There's the scene where Daniels is waiting to see the deputy ops, right, and we see him kind of in the monitor for the deputy. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then there's one right at the start when they're going into the courtroom. We see Bunk and McNulty approaching on the screen.
Yeah.
There's another episode. It might be in the second episode actually.
There's
another scene where Bunk is waiting. Oh, there's when McNulty is about to go into the FBI building. There's another shot of McNulty in the camera, in the screen. So that, yeah, it's used quite heavily. It's used to great effect.
And there's also the camera shots, isn't there? I mean, that's going back to episode 2 as well. But when Kima's taking pictures from the roof, you get the
yes, that's
the
right,
kind of black and white freeze frames for a few seconds, which is an interesting thing.
And the use of a telescopic lens to give a sense of someone looking over a great distance, rather than trying to use any of the action up close. There's a sense that we are with the character when they are in position, and sort of used. We're looking through the sort of scope or the lens as they are.
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of grounds you in that voyeurism, doesn't it? Which is that's kind of what The Wire is about, just understanding a hidden world, and I think that's what the surveillance footage really does. It speaks to that idea of digging and finding out things that you're not meant to find out. So, it's
very, very fly on the wall. If you could be a fly on the wall in a Baltimore Police Department, what would you see? And The Wire at least tries to answer that question.
Yeah, it's done very nicely. I think it's a very good addition. Any more points of discussion do you want to go for? Or should we move on to the favourite scenes and negative elements, etc.?
Well, I was also going to mention that a key element of this first episode, we see a lot of subordinates being berated by their superiors.
Yes.
It happens at sort of lots of different levels in both the drug gang and the police. So to give a couple of examples, because there are many, we have Wallace being berated by D'Angelo for sort of actually all of them are being berated for having a slack operation, but primarily Wallace for accepting fake money. We have McNulty being bollocked by pretty much everyone at every point in the episode, but most notably Rules. Then we have Daniels being berated by Forrester
Yeah.
We also have Avon Barksdale berating D'Angelo. Then we have Weebay berating D'Angelo.
Yeah.
So it happens. We basically see, particularly McNulty and D'Angelo, they are kind of shown as the, two sides of the same coin sort of thing. They certainly get it the hardest. But being told off for messing up, whether or not you meant to or otherwise, is a real theme in this first episode. Is no matter how good you try to be, you're going to screw up and someone's going to hate you for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back to that commentary, one of the great observations that David Simon made was that there's two court scene episodes, or two court scenes, in this episode. The first one is, of course, the police universe one at the start with D'Angelo and William Gant, etc. And then the second one is when Johnny Weech is being held accountable for his crime to D'Angelo, and D'Angelo decides not to give a sentence. So, Bodie and Wallace and Poot just conform to their kind of industry standard, beat him up for the $10 crime sort of thing. And it was a really nice parallel that David Simon pointed out. And I think it kind of speaks to that the idea that D'Angelo and McNulty are completely, on two sides of the same coin. And that,
Although it does seem possible. I don't know, maybe he doesn't want to make too much of a statement or show himself up in front of his subordinates. But I guess you could argue that there's nothing really stopping D'Angelo from saying that it's not worth it or to try to limit the guy's beating in some way. I think it's maybe not entirely accurate to say that he has a fully compassionate side to deliver no sentence, because he still condemns Johnny to being beat to within an inch of his life and does nothing. He literally turns his back and walks away.
Yeah.
That's not compassionate. That's that's abstaining, but it's not compassionate.
Yeah, it's kind of not having the guts to give the sentence yourself, but knowing that the sentence is an inevitability, as kind of instated by the society he's grown up in. Like, that sort of crime is unpunishable, and as much as he doesn't want to, make it clear and say it, he's just going to have to accept it and perhaps turn away. So, even though he's being held accountable as the judge in this situation, he's the superior. He can't bring himself to make that directive. So it's an interesting way.
Bit of peace of mind for him, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's possibly the most telling point in this episode for D'Angelo, and really establishes the conflict with him, like, down to a T.
Yeah, and I guess the other major character point that's revealed throughout the episode, in terms of like main characters, seeing as we're talking about D'Angelo, we also see an awful lot of McNulty's self-destructive nature, and that even when he's not in the office, he's trying to mess something up, usually himself. So we see him drinking, and we see him making a fool of himself, and there's that scene at the end where they're with the train. I'm thinking of the right moment where he basically steps in front of the train to urinate on the tracks, and nonchalantly walks off, even though he could have been very easily killed. And Bunk doesn't really say anything, which demonstrates that that's probably not the first time he's done that.
The actual what he says is he's certainly alarmed by it, but he seems to be alarmed by the fact that he's going to do the case rather than the fact that a train's about to run him over. But I guess that speaks to the heavy-handed symbolism, which is possibly this is probably the most heavy-handed metaphor in the show, actually, with the train. And they often go back to it when they're drinking by the tracks in other episodes. And it's, just the idea that, McNulty has got an inevitable end coming to him, probably through, a very nasty firing. But, he's determined to go with it anyway, just because he needs that change, or he needs that conflict in his life anyway. So it's a nice scene.
It sort of thrives off, and as with that scene, he steps away just at the right moment, nonchalantly, trying to be cool, like he's always thriving on those kind of situations where he can demonstrate just how smart and brilliant he is, irrespective of whether or not it actually makes anyone like him.
Yeah, it's just complete vanity fair, really, isn't it? So.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet he's still very likable as a character. It's quite impressive how you can create a character so conceited,
I think,
and it's so problematic and yet perfectly likable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the fact that he does stem for all this. I think that there's two levels to him that makes him really likable. First of all, it's the fact that he's just a damn good detective, and that's evidenced plenty of times during the show, and it's really impressive how well he's able to discern things in the street and understand what things mean, and just a very good investigative kind of nature. And then you also have the idea that he's completely dedicated to change, no matter what the consequences, and that's just such a rare quality in people. But the way they dress it up in The Wire makes it seem completely believable as well. It kind of seems like, when you describe it like that, it makes it seem like kind of only an idealistic thing. But it really works with him because his character's just so flawed on the surface that you kind of see that he loves the pain of being put down, all for a good cause, all for the good change. So those two things work together to make McNulty actually a really likable but very flawed kind of lead character.
And we see him in kind of unfortunate positions where, going back to us saying him being berated by rules, it's hard not to feel for McNulty in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's got to sort of give up his whole night to write some crappy report, and there's no way for him to get out of it. You could say that he brought it on himself, but we still feel for him there. Yeah,
and overall he was called back into the office by Phelan. Like, he didn't volunteer that information particularly, but I mean, I'm sure he knew that it would come back and bite him in the arse. But no, that didn't stop him. So you're right. It's particularly when rules is introduced as such a absolute kind of imperial force at the front. I mean, he's introduced with a lot of brute force, almost too much perhaps. But this guy's not meant to be likable, and he just represents everything wrong with authority. And in that moment, you do kind of feel for McNulty, even though he has, as you say, he's, ultimately is brought upon by himself. But, it's more complicated than that, really. And I think his viewers know that.
So with that in mind, shall we move on to talk about some favourite characters, or standout characters for this episode?
Yeah.
And what they did that was so standout.
For me, particularly the stuff that goes on with the criminal side of the show, D'Angelo and Avon are really the two in this episode that really got to me. I think Avon particularly, because I love how the show only gives us kind of almost a sweet 3 minutes with him, just at the top of his big empire, or that's the assumed image with him on the balcony at the back of the strip club. And you learn so much about how much of a smooth operator he is, and how insulated he is up in his strip club. You see exactly what his motivations are, and that he's very effective at, getting what he wants from people. But then you also get this big juxtaposition with his kind of logical and thorough dressing down, with kind of his clear family values that emerge at the end. And they've kind of already nailed an endearing and three-dimensional character within 3 minutes. And the first time round, I couldn't wait to see more of him. And I think the less is more approach they did with Avon was great for making him a really kind of, endearing. He's almost endearing, really, Avon, with his love family at the start. And I think just D'Angelo's, conflict, which is, epitomized by his kind of, what we described it earlier as a core hearing with, Johnny. It's a great moment for him, and shows really what this guy's been brought up in a world that's not really meant for him at all. And it's really easy to empathise with him at that point. So I think for me, those are the two standouts in this episode. What were your thoughts anyway?
Well, I really like Rawls' introduction. I think, like you say, it's very heavy hitting. He's presented with such force, and he's so sort of immediately obnoxious. But it's just brilliantly acted, and also, ever since then, if I was ever pissed off with someone, I've always wanted to put up both middle fingers and just say, "You have my undivided attention," just because that seems like such a slap in the face thing to say.
Yeah,
but yeah, Rules is kind of really shown as, like you say, he's everything wrong with authority. He's just pushing people about because he can. Why should he? How dare someone inconvenience him? How dare some small time person come up and stir some shit that he has to deal with that's not even his fault? Like, there's a real indignance that's passed down. He really tries to shame other characters basically into feeling bad.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I say that I don't massively like his first scene. I think it is too heavy-handed, and I don't think it really reflects him later on. And I know he's consistently a very heavy-hitting kind of sort of twattish character, but the way they portray him here is it was trying too hard for us to empathize with McNulty, I think, and it didn't quite hit the right note for me. But I'm, later on, I think they really understand Rules as a character, and he becomes a lot more balanced, particularly when you start seeing with his own authority figures later on, the people above him in the chain. He becomes a really interesting character, very well rounded, and clearly very smart. At, speaking his way around things. So that was my
And
take.
it's also evident that he develops and grows as a character.
Yeah.
I think it's perhaps reasonable that some of the cases that they undertake molds him in a certain way. I guess it's difficult to say because we are introduced to the character in that, like you say, it is quite heavy hitting. It's difficult to say whether he's always been that way up until then and he changes with the show, or if it really is just a bit of a blunt introduction and he's having a bad day or something.
Yeah, it's just almost shock tactics perhaps at the very start. They want to get the viewers startled. So,
It works. It's an incredibly dramatic scene.
Yeah. No, the middle fingers routine that you mentioned was great. I mean, it's very funny if nothing else. So, yeah. So Rules was kind of a standout for you then. Did you have any others, or that your?
Well, he wasn't really a standout character. I just kind of really like that scene.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's really hard not to just say D'Angelo. Like, he really is a sort of a standout character for plenty of reasons. Just trying to think back on the episode itself. So much emphasis. You're introduced to a lot of characters, and so much time is spent with D'Angelo in particular as an individual.
Yeah.
But it's kind of difficult to really point at anyone else. So I think I would just, D'Angelo in general, and obviously Avon's very good, and Rules has a great introduction. But I think at this stage in the first episode, there's perhaps a little too, not quite enough definition in individual characters to say if anyone's standing out yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
that's
think
fair.
how much of a kind of a real performance, a real kind of moment that Bubbles has later on. Season 4, season 5. He's sort of introduced quite casually.
Yeah.
He's not really. He's just shown as being a junkie.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that feeds into some of perhaps the drawbacks of this episode. I think, the show is so subtle with its characterization that, it needs more than the hour that we get here to really establish who these people are. And I think I found McNulty particularly, for a lot of it, he comes across as kind of a cliche grounding character who's the know-it-all and the one who strives for justice. And, the show alludes to his flaws at the end, but they're not fully realized until later on. And it's only after that, and with some other characters as well, once we get their grounding definition, we understand who they are, and it becomes a lot more compelling. But I think, just by process of design, that this episode can't quite deliver what the other ones deliver once they've had the chance to build up characters. So that was kind of one of my concerns about perhaps, if there's a critical element to this episode, that'd be a big one. Yeah. Interestingly, it was the lowest rated on IMDb of all the episodes of The Wire. I think it averaged an 8.1, which is still great in IMDb terms but the series average was 9.4. I was wondering whether you thought that was perhaps justified. Do you think it is the weakest episode? Does it deserve that title, or,
It's unfair to place it there because it is the first episode. What makes The Wire so strong in terms of each episode is its context and what lies around it. What lies behind? What are we looking forward to? Where are these characters right now? But with the first episode, obviously you lack the former. So that has to do all of this introductions. And like you say, and squeezing all of that within an hour is always going to be tricky. Especially when the show elects to introduce us to so many characters at once.
Yeah.
That's it's inevitable. It's unfair, but it is inevitable. Kind of like the theme of The Wire, I suppose.
Yeah, but particularly when you compare it with, shows normally go for the big event premiere, don't they? With the 90-minute pilot, the big hard-hitting first stroke, put everyone into place, and this show just nah, fuck all that. We're just gonna, just gonna drop you into this universe, and you're gonna have to stand on your own 2 feet and learn who everyone is, and you're not gonna get your comfortable kind of, popcorn pilot experience. And that, I guess that's just kind of a byproduct of that, isn't it? Really.
And it does that whilst at the same time still having that somewhat formulaic structure of the first episode.
Yeah.
Where they're forming a team. They're forming the A team to take on this new case. Like, it is that.
Yeah.
Like you say, that is the kind of the storyline, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of mix between. It's very subtle the way it is very basic, and from a story perspective, it's just painted in a very convoluted way, which makes it, it's hard. It's taxing on the first viewing. Was there any other sort of criticisms you'd like to throw towards this episode that you came across?
In terms of criticisms, I can't think of any more off the top of my head. I think it's not really a criticism, but it's something that we do really only see in this first episode. And that's that we do have exterior shots of the police buildings and where they're situated. We don't really ever get that again, which is interesting because I thought it was kind of nice to have where the police are, given a little bit of context in terms of where they are in the city, which we're never really given that again. The first episode is kind of the only one that I can think of where you get a proper shot of the police building where homicide and where narcotics is.
No, I can think of plenty of examples where we're shown, the exteriors of buildings on plenty of occasions. I mean, the City Hall is obviously a big one. That's where the detail of...
No, not exteriors of buildings, exteriors of the police buildings.
Okay, so that you mean that big kind of skyscraper in downtown that doubles as the police HQ sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it's that one, yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, that's...
We don't really ever see that much again.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they certainly show other buildings, but yeah, I know what you mean, that big...
Oh yeah, they show plenty of other building exteriors, but I mean, this one in particular, the police building, we see the inside of that building so much and the outside so little.
Yeah.
Whereas lots of other places, like you say, City Hall and whatnot, we do see a lot of exterior shots to establish where it is in the context of Baltimore.
Yeah, no,
we kind of get that once with that police building and never again, which is interesting. Not necessarily a criticism, but
yeah. I mean, you could always argue that once you've identified its location, it's you trust the audience to remember. But absolutely, I mean,
but the same isn't true of other buildings. We're given exterior shots of other buildings on several other occasions. So, for example, the building that has the detail in season 2 and onwards, that sort of outward building.
Yeah, that's quite a famous one, isn't it? It's almost the derelict looking building. It's down by the docks, isn't it? And they certainly do throw that one down your throat. You get a lot of even characters sort of hanging out around outside that building. They certainly peg that one a fair amount. And obviously, particularly when they go out to the east side and west side, you see an awful lot of grounding, kind of almost aerial shots of how downtown relates to the kind of more ghetto areas in the east and west. And it's quite nice from an imagery perspective how the big skyscrapers kind of dominate in the background. These tiny low rises sort of, a mile or so away. They're so close, but just so completely separate. So, I think the show dealing with geography is done very subtly, but it certainly does a very effective job of grounding all the locations in your head. And I've never really thought about it before, really, but it actually does it very, very effectively without any map usage whatsoever. So,
well, that's of course coming from someone who pretty much studies sort of urban planning and whatnot. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think you would know better than most.
Absolutely,
about,
it does away with maps,
of cities
which
and how it works. It wasn't something that I had my mind on particularly.
I guess for me, I think we've gone over most of the criticisms. Obviously, there's that flashback, which is, it's an arguable criticism as well. I think for you it was, perhaps for me it wasn't. The catchphrases. We also have perhaps the focus on characters. This is a design choice which may or may not be a limitation depending on how you look at it, but particularly the top level of police with Forster and Burrell. I'm sure we've talked about this before in the podcast, but they're just not they're not focused on, even though they should, or arguably should. They put everything into motion, and nevertheless we just see the kind of the ones on the bottom struggling with it, and it makes it very disorienting for first-time viewers. Like Forster's seen maybe 2 or 3 times in tiny snippets at the beginning and end of scenes, like when Daniels goes to a meeting with him, I think, doesn't he, to hand in the report that Greg's typed up for him. And talks about how McNulty handed in the rules of phone book, and Greg's handed in, I think, 4 sheets, which obviously makes sense because McNulty, he makes it what he does to collect information about Barksdale because he's passionate about catching him. It's a very logical scene, but it's not given any gravitas at all. It's very much just blasé, and Forster is, it's a key arbiter in this episode, but he's just not given any time. And that's just the way they've wanted to portray it, but it does perhaps give the wrong impression to first-time viewers, and I could possibly consider that a limitation of the episode, really, the design flaw. So that'll be
right.
my.
So with all of that sorted, let's talk a little bit about the episode's title and the epigraph.
So the title, what are we going for? The target? It's pretty low key. Yeah. The show doesn't go for big grandstanding titles. It's particularly not in the first season anyway. It's just the target. And I guess in terms of what various meanings there could be for this title, obviously Avon Barksdale is the obvious one. The target of the detail. We've got perhaps William Gant is the target of the Barksdales at the end. Then you also perhaps got McNulty and D'Angelo as the targets of authority. They're trying to weasel out the people that are ruining their smooth operations, and they're being targeted and dressed down by superiors.
Yeah.
So
there's also the targets that the police are trying to meet.
Yes.
Daniels is trying to meet targets that are given to him from on high.
Yes, absolutely. Living, duking the stats by the numbers. Yeah, absolutely. That's one I hadn't considered, actually.
I mean, I guess you could, if you were going to really dig, I suppose you could say something like Johnny and Bubbles. Their target is getting high. They're doing they're pulling whatever scheme they need to in order to be able to get their vials.
So that speaks to almost universal motivation. So just what everyone's looking for from their life.
Yeah. So I guess we can combine that to say that the target is just, here's what everyone's motivations are. Here's what people are aiming to do, and here's what they've got to do to try and get it. And are they succeeding or are they failing?
Yeah.
I guess that's kind of basic storytelling, but
yeah, absolutely. No,
it seems to make a point of it in this first episode because it is an introductory episode.
Yeah, so a very low-key title appears to have a multitude of meanings, and actually quite apt in the end.
Yeah, that's the fun in it, is drawing all of these meanings out of.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll enjoy doing it week to week.
Simple things.
Yeah. Epigraph-wise, but when it's not your turn, or is it actually? It might be shorter than that. Yeah, when it's not your turn, McNulty.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts here?
So this is another sort of not necessarily a catchphrase, but it's a phrase that appears said by other characters across the show about giving a fuck when it's not your turn to give a fuck. And obviously, just especially in terms of McNulty, it refers to butting your head in and making a load of noise about certain issues when it's not your responsibility to do so. And as a result, you sort of drag other people down with you in some way.
Yeah.
And I think we first hear it. Do we first hear it with the Bunk and McNulty scene with the decomp?
I think it is, yeah. And that's right. And I think it's actually
obviously he's McNulty. Actually, it's kind of McNulty berating Bunk. Again, this relates to people being berated, but not necessarily by superiors in this case. Although McNulty might like to think of himself as a superior.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's actually when he's berating Bunk, isn't it? I think it's misquoted. It's actually ain't your turn, but he says, not your turn, and is clearly having a go at Bunk for picking up the phone when he's not supposed to pick up the phone. And then, of course, this is ridiculous when you consider that McNulty has just thrown open, the the judge's concerns for the witness, and who's really stepped out of turn to a larger extent, and quite ironic in that sense, really. And
shows a certain, a real kind of, maybe it's playful in this scene, but it still shows a certain hypocrisy on McNulty's part.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's there's obviously a big focus on the whole not your turn element, and that I think clearly indicates that the show is stressing that the most important things you're going to see on this show are kind of born out of when characters do things against their self-interest. So this is perhaps otherwise known to people in the universe of the show as doing things out of your turn. And, according to this society, doing things out of your turn is doing things that aren't within your self-interest. If you're being selfless, you're doing things out of turn. And it's this ingrained idea that everything is about self-preservation and, making sure that everything is fine with you, but society itself, falls victim to it. So, that's kind of the wider meaning with it.
So it's stamping expectations on characters. It's basically, do you think it's sort of, this is who you are and this is what's expected of you, don't colour outside the lines?
Absolutely, and I think that's the sentiment with it, and it feeds back into, you have to let him play. It's America, man. This is what's expected of you. Everyone's going to go and play the game, but ultimately everyone's going to fall victim to their own interests, and it's going to mess everyone up in the process. So, it's actually, again, a very short, simplistic, kind of almost half sentence of a quote, but with a lot of grandstanding meaning in the wider context of The Wire. So.
Yeah, and it shows up in various other episodes across the seasons. There's a few other examples of people using it.
It almost becomes one of the catchphrases, doesn't it? But perhaps not so ingratiating.
Largely because it's spoken by different characters.
Yeah.
Over the time, rather than sort of one character given their little line.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like an ideal that they all live by, rather than just a little, here's me doing my bit.
Well, it feels like common speak amongst the police, doesn't it? So the slang, the colloquialisms that they have amongst the police, amongst the detectives, it just feels like it could be one of those.
Yeah,
this is just a phrase that's been handed down over time.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's one of the great things about the show is that they make no concessions with their jargon, and the vacant apartment, everything is just straight down to the way they communicate, and it's done quite well because it's never unclear what they're talking about, but it never feels like you're being handed down to, and it's done really well.
Yeah, it's nothing a Google search won't fix. Right. I think that's pretty much it for episode 1 then.
Excellent. I'm very pleased.
That's it. Episode 1 finished.
Fantastic. Bring on the second.
To close us down, I will just say that we are recording episode 2 straight after this episode, so if we do get any messages or emails or anything like that, they will have to be dealt with in the episode 3, because obviously we'll be recording it straight after this. Until then, you can catch us on caughtonthewire.wordpress.com and chuck us an email at caughtonthewire@gmail.com. And until next time, take it easy.
Bye-bye, see you then.
What you know about Baltimore? What you know about Baltimore? Baltimore. What you know about Baltimore? What you know about Baltimore?